We're going to talk a little bit about photosynthesis here. I've kind of set up a chloroplast for you. I've got a little tiny poorly drawn chloroplast in green because they're green up here. So we've got our outer membrane, our second membrane, which contains all the stroma inside, the fluid inside the chloroplast. And then here we've got stacks of thylakoid membranes, which are their own sort of balloons of fluid within the stroma. And then I've blown up one of these thylakoids. So here is a thylakoid within the stroma of the chloroplast. And I wanted to sort of show you how energy is harnessed by the chloroplast, initially in the light-dependent reactions, and then how that energy that's initially harvested is used to create stored chemical and organic energy as glucose. So initially what happens is we have solar energy hitting the chloroplast, and particularly hitting this protein called chlorophyll. There's actually two types of chlorophyll and two other major pigments within the chloroplast that harvest solar energy, harvest photons of light energy. But we're going to focus on chlorophyll. We'll just call them all chlorophyll. We won't distinguish between the two types of chlorophyll, really. So initially what we've got is solar energy coming down, and it gets hit. The chlorophyll is struck by these photons of light, and I'm drawing very poorly in red, so we'll call them sunlight. And in the chlorophyll molecule, the photons of light are harvested and fed to some electrons, two electrons, and the electrons get energized, and they get so energized that they sort of blast away from the nucleus of the molecule that they're on, of the atom they're attached to, and they get zipped through some enzymes. So here's a couple of electrons. They zip through enzymes associated with the chlorophyll. Okay, and that energy is used to pump protons into the system. So the energy from the solar sources is used to power electrons, and then the electrons pump protons across the thylakoid membrane and into the inside of the thylakoid. Now, there's two places for the electrons to go, two places for them to end up. The electrons can go from one chlorophyll through the enzymes and then get harvested by another chlorophyll to replace the electrons that it lost. If that is what happens, then the reaction is called cyclical. So this is the cyclic reaction. I'll write that down here, cyclic. So if electrons are going from chlorophyll to chlorophyll, that's called cyclic. The electrons, though, can also go out and join up with an ion, or an ion molecule. It's a gigantic molecule, so I shouldn't call it an ion, really. But it's an NADP and a proton, which is an H ion. Okay, you get the two electrons there, and you wrap all that together, and that becomes an energy source called NADPH. So you've got energy now to feed into the dark reactions, okay, or the light independent reactions to fix carbon and generate glucose from it. So if the electrons move from chlorophyll to chlorophyll, that's the cyclic reaction. If they move from chlorophyll out to NADP and then make NADPH, that is non-cyclic. The molecules, or I'm sorry, the electrons did not end up back in a chlorophyll. They ended up outside of a chlorophyll, so they didn't cycle through. They sort of left the system temporarily. All right, now this chlorophyll here that I've drawn needs to replace the electrons that it lost. And in one of the reactions, one of the photosystems, that is done by ripping electrons off of water. What happens then, once you rip water apart, and I'll rip water apart twice here, get my electrons moving through the enzyme system. Okay. Once you rip water apart, you get the hydrogens. That's where the electrons come from. They become protons, which are essentially hydrogen ions. So each water yields 2 protons. And then in addition to that, you get oxygen. So then you get oxygen and oxygen. And if you get 2 oxygens together, that is O2 gas. So that's oxygen gas. So that's where the oxygen comes from in photosynthesis. Solar energy is powering these electrons to pump protons into the thylakoid membrane. And to replace those electrons, water gets ripped apart. As a waste product of that destruction of water, you get oxygen gas. Now, what has happened here is that we're putting electrons out here into the stroma, and we're pumping protons in here into the thylakoid membrane. So just like in cellular respiration, what's happening is that the system is building a cellular battery. Now the system will let the battery run through ATP synthase. So here's my little molecules, or I'm sorry, enzymes, really, they're gigantic, of ATP synthase. We'll have protons come out here too, because it's easier to draw down here in the corner. So the protons come out through ATP synthase, and as they come out, once again, they influence the enzyme to crank down and snap ADP onto ATP, and that generates adenosine triphosphate, ATP, in the stroma. So the light-dependent reactions use solar energy, photons of light, to energize electrons. The electrons are sent through an enzyme system, some of them out into the stroma. So you build up electrons out here. You build up protons here because the energy from the electrons pumps protons across the thylakoid membrane. To replace the electrons lost by chlorophyll, you rip water apart, creating even more protons. So you've got the positive charge inside the thylakoid, the negative charge inside the stroma, outside the thylakoid membrane. So then the system just lets the protons meet the electrons, and as the protons are moving through ATP synthase, ATP is synthesizing ATP. It's synthesizing ATP by snapping ADP onto free phosphates. So at that point, what you've got is the building of 2 energy molecules, the ATP and the NADPH. And so now solar energy has been harvested and converted to temporary chemical energy. Once you've got the temporary chemical energy, you can use it whether you've got more sunlight or not. So the reactions in which ATP and NADPH are used, those are light independent. They can occur without the presence of sunlight. So we've got light dependent reactions here. So down here, these are light dependent reactions. Because they cannot occur without the input of solar energy. This stuff over here, the Calvin cycle, those are light independent reactions. They do not require solar energy to directly power them. All right, so let's talk about these. And we're just going to go over this pretty quick. What happens is there's this sort of enzyme that grabs CO2 out of the stroma and attaches it into the enzyme temporarily and snaps that onto a sugar coming out of this side of the cycle. It's a 5-carbon sugar. It gets CO2 attached to it, so then it becomes a 6-carbon sugar, but it's unstable, so it breaks apart into 2 3-carbons. And then those are processed through the cycle to generate another 5-carbon up here to go through the cycle again, but also a 3-carbon that can go down into another process that will grab a couple of those 3-carbon sugars and snap them together in glucose. The inputs to the system are ATP. So ATP comes in and powers part of this cycle and gives off ADP and free phosphate, which can then return to the thylakoid and the ATP synthase there and hook up to be made ATP in the light-dependent reactions. After the first ATP is used, NADPH is used, yielding NADP plus and a free hydrogen ion. And then after NADPH is used and a 3-carbon sugar is spun off towards the glucose pathway, the other 3-carbon sugar is spun up in the cycle. ATP is used once again, yielding more ADP and free phosphate to hook up again with ATP synthase back at the thylakoid membrane. And you regenerate from that 3-carbon, that other 3-carbon sugar, the 5-carbon sugar, that will then grab CO2, break in half again, and start the cycle again. So we're generating chemical energy here from sunlight, using the chemical energy in the Calvin cycle to fix carbon from the inorganic world into the organic world in the form of long-term stored chemical energy and organic matter as glucose.